dean theology at Notre Dame. His father-in-law died suddenly, so he will not be here to share this part of the meeting. We want to keep him in our prayers, his father-in-law. And I'm going to turn this over to Marty Trial. She's graciously going to assume this responsibility. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Well, welcome back, everybody. We are gathered here for the next keynote address. The topic is Monsignor Romero, Martyr of Solidarity. And we're so pleased to be able to welcome home our own Michael Lee. Around here, we call him a triple domer. That means somebody who has gotten 3 degrees from this place. So welcome back. And he is also an associate professor of systematic theology at Fordham University. And among other publications, he is the author of the award-winning Bearing the Weight of Salvation, the Soteriology of Ignacio Ellacuría. And recently, he also translated and edited a book on Ignacio Ellacuría, Essays on History, Liberation, and Salvation. And responding to Michael will be Robert Ellsworth, the editor-in-chief of Orbis Books. I'm sure you're all familiar with Orbis Books, and we're all very grateful for Orbis and their mission. Robert came to that work through his work first as managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper for 2 years. I feel a special connection in that way. And those of us who read Give Us This Day, the daily missal published by the Benedictines at St. John's Abbey, encounter the reflections on the lives of the saints every morning, or whenever it is during the day that you read that. But for me, it's in the morning. So I feel like you're part of our prayers in that way. So welcome to you both. And Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margie, for those kind words of introduction, and thank you. It is such an honor to be here. It was 30 years ago, this fall semester, that I entered Notre Dame as a freshman. And a Puerto Rican charismatic Catholic whose love of God extended to charity for those who are less fortunate. That faith was changed. It was confronted with a reality, and in the 1980s it was especially confronted with the reality of El Salvador. And in deep, deep gratitude for people like Don McNeil, whose Center for Social Concerns, and in fact for his reflection course after a summer at Andre House of Hospitality, for the amazing photographs of Steve Moriarty, for the testimony of Dora, who came up from a repatriated community, speaking of the reality of El Salvador, which in 1986 was not an easy thing to have communicated. And especially thank you to Father Bob, whose untiring commitment, especially embodied in the Romero lectures, in the documentary, and in this gathering, has effects that, well, I don't think you may even know them. I can say for myself personally, it is a dream and a kind of scary nightmare to be on this stage. Having seen so many of the Romero lectures here, to remember Dean Brackley, and so many others. So it is a deep, deep privilege and honor to be with you today. It is also with the deepest irony, and as a domer, I do need to speak these words. As one who lives in New York, that this would happen the only weekend that the Notre Dame football team is in New York. And so, With the documentation regarding Archbishop Oscar Romero's martyrdom nearing delivery to theologians of the Congregation for the Cause of Saints, we have another signal that Romero's canonization approaches. However, while this moment represents the imminent conclusion of one process, we hope, it also reaffirms a second ongoing process. For while many look expectantly for the official recognition of San Romero by the global Catholic Church, the meaning of that sainthood will always be negotiated. This is particularly true of his martyrdom, the significance of which has been a critical piece in the decades-long struggle over Romero's process. With the March 24, 1980 murder of Archbishop Romero, one that took place while he was presiding at a celebration of the Eucharist, it appears one has an exemplary instance of a Christian martyrdom and sainthood. Indeed, Romero is often mentioned with previous bishop martyr saints such as Thomas Becket and Stanislaus of Krakow. And I have to say, I have now in my margins the names of just about every presenter and what has already been mentioned here, so forgive the repetition. However, since that tragic night in 1980, the matter of his martyrdom has been an obstacle. In a press conference earlier this year, which we've already heard quoted, Pope Francis summed up the problem, and I take a portion of his statement. What I would like, he said, is to have clarified when there is martyrdom in odium fidei, whether it is for confessing the credo or for performing the works that Jesus commands us to do for our neighbor. There is a work of theologians that is being studied. And as my wife said, well, isn't it nice the Pope is writing your papers for you? I only said I only wish he could come up with the menu for tonight's dinner. It's hard for me to think of what to cook. Because behind him, Romero, there is Rutilio Grande, and there are others. There are others that were also killed but are not at the same height as Romero. This question that Jim has raised. This has to be distinguished theologically. For me, Romero is a man of God. Despite the dramatic image of Romero being gunned down at the altar, some have questioned whether his death truly stemmed from hatred of the faith or rather from so-called political motivations. It's a difficult question to answer, but it is important because of its implications for how we understand martyrdom. As Francis notes, there are many others behind Romero, like Rutilio Grande. One could add other bishops, such as Enrique Angelelli of Argentina, Juan José Gerardi of Guatemala. Even if we limit ourselves to the Salvadoran story, there are 5 other priests murdered during Romero's ministry as archbishop. There are hundreds of catechists, religious, and base community members who are arrested, tortured, or killed for their work. And of course, there are the thousands of Salvadorans, the ones Ignacio Ellacuría calls the crucified people, whose deaths are a part of the story that cannot be ignored. Today, I'd like to investigate the questions regarding Romero's case with the hope that it clarifies a theology of martyrdom that can more adequately name and honor the brave witnesses to the Christian faith that we have seen and indeed continue to see in our midst. In Romero, we have a paradigmatic instance of what I will call a martyr of solidarity, whose commitment to follow Jesus faithfully in a preferential option for the poor was consummated in a death carried out by those who opposed this life of discipleship. I'll carry out the argument in 3 steps. First, I will identify ways that certain applications of the death out of hatred of the faith in odium fidei criterion causes problems for a contemporary understanding of martyrdom. Second, I'd like to draw upon contemporary theologians who have tried to address these problems. But in particular, I'd like to turn to a theological voice that is often overlooked, namely that of Archbishop Romero himself. Though far from producing a full-fledged theology of martyrdom, Romero's homilies, delivered in the context of so many deaths, offer us intuitions for a renewed notion of martyrdom. Finally, in order to integrate the preceding insights, I'd like to utilize the understanding of poverty voiced by the Latin American bishops at Medellin as a template for understanding martyrdom in a new way. That is, drawing from the threefold understanding of poverty, we might distinguish three types of martyrs: martyrs of reality, spiritual martyrs, and martyrs of solidarity or commitment. In this way, I hope to offer criteria by which we can identify more clearly the significance of Romero's martyrdom, and in turn, allow Romero's death to deepen our understanding of martyrdom today. Now, to speak of martyrdom is a difficult thing and should be approached with great trepidation, lest the memory of remarkable witnesses be trivialized. It is upon sacred ground that we tread when dealing with such great commitment in the face of horrible violence. Overwhelming as these testimonies can be, there is a reason why the people of God cling to the memories of martyrs. Whether to encourage a faith struggling under persecution, or to unsettle a faith atrophying in complacency, martyrs confront us with the holy mystery of the gospel. As the Gospel of John says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. My belief is that Monsignor Romero's case demonstrates how martyrdom remains a useful category today if it springs from a more integral vision of human life responding to the demands of faith. Only then can it account for the various ambiguities and articulate positively what the martyr is and what martyrdom looks like. And so problems with death in odium fidei. When I mention martyrdom in a college classroom, students conjure up visions resembling gladiator films, with Christians before a cruel Roman emperor who demands that they renounce their faith or die. To be sure, it is a caricature from an audience that is remotely familiar with the Bible, much less early Christian martyrologies. However, that caricature is revelatory of the manner that the notion of death in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith, works in the present Christian imagination and raises problems for a contemporary understanding of martyrdom. It has been decades since Karl Rahner made a plea for the broadening of the concept of martyrdom, as his Concilium article was entitled, but Romero's case demonstrates that there still is progress to be made. This is not to suggest that odium fidei should be discarded. As we know, martyr derives from martyreo, the Greek term meaning to testify or to give witness, such as in a courtroom setting. And as is clear in our litigious society, the courtroom is not neutral, but functions as a fundamentally adversarial setting. One is a witness for the prosecution or for the defense. One testifies for something or against something else. In this sense, odium fidei rightly captures the tension faced by Christian witness in the face of opposition. However, an understanding of this conflict that identifies it in an exclusively intellectual or confessional manner distorts the reality of Christian witness. As Jose Ignacio Gonzalez Faust has argued, the language of odium fidei that is formalized in the mid-1700s undergoes an important transformation and comes to connote a reductive view of faith. Its meaning shifts over time as the emphasis moves from the odium, so a hatred inflicted on death that is passive, or in contrast to one engaged in a struggle like a soldier, to a stress on the fidei, the faith, where the latter is colored by the battles of the Counter-Reformation. In this mindset, faith is understood as an intellectual, verbal confession that ignores the praxis and life of the believer. I would argue that it is from this intellectualized or confessional understanding that the objections to Monsignor Romero and many others stem. Before he is killed, Monsignor Romero was not commanded to renounce Christianity, at least in the sense of renouncing a creed. And this has led some to conclude that his death was not a martyrdom in the proper sense. At one level, one can demonstrate that this restrictive understanding of odium fidei has been put aside. Think of Maria Goretti, murdered in resistance to rape, or Maximilian Kolbe, who, though at his beatification was recognized as a confessor for volunteering to die in the place of another in Auschwitz, was ultimately canonized a martyr. One can even think as far back to Aquinas, who noted that John the Baptist, technically speaking, couldn't have had Christian faith. Yet, in Romero's case, the reductionist view of faith is reinforced by a distorted view of the odium that places too much value on the often distorted perspective of the persecutor. In a Salvadoran context, in which teaching basic literacy or gathering for Bible study would be considered politically subversive, or where murderous acts could be justified as defending order and the true faith, the criterion of odium fidei should not be used to support the reductionist suppositions of the persecutor. If Christianity is an incarnational faith, as we've heard, where true orthodoxy and orthopraxy mutually inhere, then odium fidei cannot rest on a strict division between the life of faith and life in the world, making the latter either secondary to faith or disconnected from it altogether. In addition, then, to the problems with hatred and faith, it may seem odd to say, but too often a focus on death. Death itself obscures the meaning of martyrdom. Though obviously the martyr's death serves to distinguish her or his legacy, there is the danger that by focusing so much on the death of the martyr, the life that preceded the final testimony can be lost. Without a sense of the martyr's life, the death has no grounding. There are no criteria to evaluate the meaning of this death, leaving the legacy of the martyr subject to the ideological whims of those who would invoke their memory. In the case of Romero, the vulnerability of this legacy has often been cited as a reason for the length of his canonization process. And again, a quote that has been cited already. In 2007, Benedict XVI explains, and I'll take a portion of that quote, admitting that Romero was an important witness of the faith. Pope Benedict said, "The problem was that a political party wrongly wished to use him as their badge, as an emblematic figure." And then he asks the question, how can we shed light on his person in the right way and protect it from these attempts, or perhaps others, to exploit it? This is the problem. I don't say this very often, but I agree with Pope Benedict on this. I believe that addressing three questions, that was unkind. I believe that addressing three questions latent in the formula death in hatred of the faith can shed light on Romero's legacy and help protect it from exploitation of whatever kind, whether political or ecclesiological, from the left or from the right. The first concerns the question of death. How is the martyr's death to be understood in its historical reality? A corollary to this question involves understanding the martyr's death in the context of so many other deaths. It might seem inconceivable to separate Romero from the context and violence in his El Salvador. But if we consider a case like that of Martin Luther King Jr., we see how the temptation operates. An important element now in the observation of the national holiday commemorating King in this country is to make sure that he is not separated from others who died in the civil rights struggle. Whether in the SCLC or SNCC, whether in sit-ins or freedom rides, whether working for voting rights or integrated education, the suffering and deaths of these many others in the struggle give King's murder a context and grounding. However, these valiant witnesses cannot be thought of outside the even wider circle of those African Americans who have borne the brunt of living daily under Jim Crow. How does one honor the strange fruit about which Billie Holiday hauntingly sang? Accounting for these others is daunting, but it helps us to remember figures such as King and Romero, not as isolated hero figures or sanitized relics who provide little more than abstract platitudes about racial harmony or justice. The priests, religious, catechists, and others who faced horrible military and paramilitary repression offer a thickness to the context of Romero's martyrdom. But these also need to be weighed while accounting for that popular majority of Salvadorans who since the colonial period have suffered under oppression and repression. The question of death is followed by the question of hatred. What is the role of the killer's odium in evaluating the legacy of the martyr? In the case of Romero, the question also forces one to wrestle with how to integrate the life and death of the martyr. For the majority of his life and priesthood, Romero did not engender hatred from those who would eventually carry out or welcome his death. It points to the serious issue regarding how one understands that change that took place in Romero's person and ministry as he assumed the role of Archbishop. As powerful and dramatic a change as we see in Romero, it has been important to remain aware of the continuities in Romero's life, a theme we have heard. Throughout his life, Romero was a man of prayer. He was a man of piety, of devotion. He embraced his priestly vocation with a thoroughness of dedication throughout his whole life. One could assert that in the Christian tradition, the witness of such utter devotion to God has been described as a kind of martyrdom. Yet as lofty and important as is the notion of what we might call a spiritual martyrdom is, a notion, it must be said, that puts forward a clear and accessible challenge to each and every one of us. It can skewer the real martyrdom of Romero, for as essential, as integral, as the faith and prayer life that Romero cultivated throughout his life is to his death, a spiritualized martyrdom that sets aside or discounts the immediate conflicts and interests that brought about his death, that too ultimately distorts the picture. The challenge then is not to reject the notion of spiritual martyrdom and the fullness of devotion it connotes, but rather to hold the spiritual together with the historical in remembering and proclaiming the legacy of the martyr. The first two questions then culminate in a third regarding faith. How can one properly name those actions taken by the martyr in obedience to the gospel's calling? Those words and actions that most immediately prompt the resistance of opposing powers. As we have seen, in the case of Romero, the question is posed by those who have opposed calling his murder a case of Christian martyrdom. However, there is also a subtle variation of this question by which the political commitment is recognized. The historical acts are recognized but separated from and subordinated to an abstract or interiorized understanding of faith. It is the mindset that sees solidarity with the poor and the commitment to justice as good but secondary, as positive byproducts of faith, but somehow not integral to its understanding. Many have already attempted to address these concerns, and while I will attempt to incorporate their insights, I'd like to turn now to those of Oscar Romero himself. Romero was not an academic theologian, and one searches in vain for writings of his that break new theoretical ground on theological topics. However, if we understand theology as, to borrow a phrase from a friend of ours, critical reflection on praxis in light of the Word of God, then we can affirm that the years during which Romero was Archbishop of San Salvador provide a dramatic Christian praxis on which critical reflection can and should, indeed must, be done. And this is true particularly on the topic of martyrdom. As the military and paramilitary activity under the regime of General Humberto Romero and the subsequent junta meant an extraordinary level of violence directed at the church. Romero does his most significant and explicit reflection on martyrdom in the homilies delivered at the funeral masses for the 6 priests murdered during his tenure as Archbishop: Rutilio Grande, Alfonso Navarro, Ernesto Barrera, Octavio Ortiz, Rafael Palacios, and Alirio Macias. These homilies give him the opportunity to reflect on the testimony offered by these men and those killed with them. They let him articulate views on martyrdom that serve 2 theological purposes. They lift up the martyrs as a sign of encouragement to a persecuted church, but simultaneously, they respond to those critics, including some within the church and even within the Salvadoran Bishops' Conference, who not only questioned the activity of these priests, but also denied that there was any persecution of the church at all. There are some dangers with this approach that I'd like to acknowledge. The first is that it privileges the clerical status. The archbishop, speaking about the death of priests, can overshadow the significance of many more lay people and religious, especially women, who are being persecuted and killed in this period, and whose deaths had a tremendous impact on Romero and the direction of pastoral ministry. Homilies are also, by their very nature, limited in their opportunity to elaborate, clarify, and entertain arguments, even if they are 2 hours long. Despite these limitations, Romero's homilies, emerging from the crucible of intense persecution, provide us compelling responses to our 3 questions and helpful categories to think martyrdom anew in our times. As we have heard and so eloquently spoken about in the previous presentation, on March 12, 1977, while driving his car from Aguilares to El Paisnal, Rutilio Grande was murdered, with 72-year-old Manuel Solorzano and 16-year-old Nelson Rutilio Lemus, who were accompanying him. 2 months later, Father Alfonso Navarro was shot along with 14-year-old Luisito Alfredo Torres. For Romero, it was no coincidence that priests were killed along with other Salvadorans. In fact, it followed from the incarnational nature of the church. As he would put it in a later homily, quote, "It would be sad if in a country where murder is being committed so horribly, we were not to find priests among the victims. They are the testimony of a church incarnated in the problems of her people." A pillar of Romero's theological thinking is that the church needs to be, as the title of his 2nd pastoral letter says, the body of Christ in history. Martyrs then are a symbol par excellence of this incarnation by sharing in the fate of so many other Salvadorans. On January 20th, 1979, soldiers battered the entrance to the El Despertar Retreat Center with an armored car and killed Father Octavio Ortiz along with 4 young men, 22-year-olds Ángel Morales and Roberto Orellana, and 15-year-olds David Caballero and Jorge Gomez. After arresting the remaining survivors, soldiers staged a cover-up, dragging the bodies of the dead boys to the roof of the building and putting pistols in their hands. Romero had known Ortiz for a long time and even had the privilege of presiding over his ordination to priesthood. as he reflected on the murders of these 5. He noted that these martyrs are, quote, messengers of reality. Messengers of reality. Of the reality of our people and the noble aspirations of the church that desires nothing more than the salvation of the people. Ironically, the violence, the calumnies, the deception at work at El Despertar stand out not because they were exceptional, but precisely because they revealed the situation of the people. Theologically, their deaths reveal the reality of sin. And as revealers, they bear the retaliation of those whose interests lie in protecting that reality. In this way, martyrs have a basic function that is negative. They reveal the workings and real presence of sin, and by their witness, denounce it. This negative function is what links them to all the victims of history. And martyrs cannot be understood if their deaths are separated from the reality in which they lived. Positively, martyrs function as a sign, as pointing to the path of conversion and modeling the utter dependence on God that is the calling of all believers. Recall the Bedouin story that comes at the beginning of Alfonso Navarro's funeral mass that was mentioned this morning by Mauro. While Romero lifted up martyrs as special exemplars who should be admired, he also made a place for martyrdom as a spiritual condition that should be desired by all believers. In a mass just days after the funeral of Alfonso Navarro, the one with the Bedouin story, Romero claimed that God asks everyone to have a spirit of martyrdom. All believers should be willing to give their lives, especially in the day-to-day commitment of faith. In this sense, martyrs are a model for imitation because they demonstrate a complete dependence on God, to which all believers should aspire. For Romero, martyrdom is a spiritual disposition rooted in the gospel's basic demand to proclaim the Lord's message. Tying it to his wonderful ecclesiological image of the church as the microphone of God, Romero states, every Catholic has to be a martyr, a witness of the message that God has to proclaim freely. However, this is not merely pious faith. He contrasts a, quote, pious, comfortable gospel with the one evidenced in Aguilares in the wake of Grande's murder and the horrible suffering that community experienced then. Thus, Romero will often call others to adopt a spirit of martyrdom that connotes this fuller commitment. He draws from the example of Octavio Ortiz, one who had his face crushed by a tank, to proclaim that all believers should turn their faces to the Lord. To seminarians preparing for ordination, he calls them all to be open to martyrdom. To a group receiving the sacrament of confirmation, he says that the sacrament itself is one of martyrdom, where the disposition is to be, quote, willing to give our lives for Christ and not betray him with the cowardice of today's inauthentic Christians. Tough words, especially to a group of young people getting confirmation. The reference to the authenticity of Christian faith indicates where Romero identifies a distinctive role for martyrs. What differentiates the martyr from other believers is the manner that their Christian witness encounters opposition. On May 11th, 1977, Romero presided over the foreign minister's funeral mass, Mauricio Borgonovo, who had been kidnapped and murdered by members of the FPL. That afternoon, 4 men entered the rectory of the Resurrection Parish in San Salvador and shot Alfonso Navarro and Luisito Torres. A statement was published by a group calling itself the Unión de Guerreros Blancos, the UGB, the White Warriors Union, that claimed responsibility for the shooting as retaliation for the death of Borgonovo. They would distribute the infamous flyer that read, Haz patria, mata un cura. Be a patriot, kill a priest. For Romero, hatred like this comes from those who reject the values of the gospel. He notes, when one proclaims the message of God before the powers of this earth, people are disturbed and will persecute and attempt to destroy the messenger. In light of persecution, then, the martyr serves as a touchstone to what Romero terms authentic Christianity, that confronts social injustice as part of the gospel's call. This is a reality, he states, and Catholics who do not see this reality, who do not want to unite themselves to the voice of the church that denounces this reality and cries out for a more just world, such persons are not true members of the authentic church that the Lord desires for our time. Recall that in his second pastoral letter, Romero had delineated the inauthentic, non-evolving traditionalism of those who could not accept a church proclaiming a message of justice with the authentic Christian tradition that took its cues from the ministry of Jesus to be incarnated in the world and to make it resemble more closely the reign of God that Jesus preached. For Romero, the faith for which and by which martyrs die conforms to the example of Christ. They say no to violence. They forgive even those who kill them. The final words of Navarro. They point the way of God's will. Like Navarro, they are a, quote, gift of redemption here on earth through which to struggle for a more just and human world. Like Ortiz, they communicate that the world in its present form is passing away, and the only thing that will remain is the joy of having used this world in order to make the kingdom of God present. In Romero's preaching, we find compelling responses to our three questions. Concerning death, Romero sees martyrs as messengers of reality, those whose deaths reveal the ways that sin dominates, the ways that present circumstances violate the will of God for human fulfillment. As a messenger of reality, the martyr dies not in isolation. To the contrary, the martyr's death derives meaning precisely in its revelatory power to unmask the reality of evil throughout a society. In the face of hatred, martyrs demonstrate the complete surrender to God that is the calling of every believer. Romero understands encountering hatred as a natural consequence of authentic Christian witness. It is a witness that illuminates faith today. In Romero's eyes, martyrs serve as a touchstone for authentic Christianity in their utter commitment to make present the reign of God and invite others to share in that same task. Romero sees martyrs as witnesses to an embodied faith, an enfleshed model of the preferential option for the poor. In their landmark meeting of 1968, the Latin American bishops grapple with the notion of poverty in a way that can help us deal with the questions raised concerning martyrdom. In their document on the poverty of the church, the bishops confront the profound contrast experience of Latin American Christians who, on the one hand, experience poverty as a dehumanizing phenomenon, but on the other hand, live within a tradition that sometimes speaks glowingly of poverty, right? And Father Gustavo opened our conference with this thinking. In the face of starvation, homelessness, illiteracy, and violent repression, what does it mean to say, "Blessed are the poor"? Their response provides us a template by which we can delineate different understandings of martyrdom that better account for the problems described thus far. The bishops identify three different meanings for poverty that address the dilemma of its negative and positive connotations. The first meaning corresponds to that negative dimension of poverty, that is material poverty. It is, quote, poverty as a lack of the goods of this world necessary to live worthily as human beings, end quote. This sense of poverty, one which we must painfully acknowledge as widespread today as it was in 1968, is that state of deprivation that means death. It is the poverty of oppression, the injustice against which the prophets denounced. It is the poverty that is contrary to the reign of God proclaimed by Jesus. Thus, theologically, this meaning of poverty must be evaluated as nothing other than sin, as that which is contrary to God's will for human life and flourishing. In contrast to this notion of material poverty, the bishops recognize how the term poverty has had an important role in the Jewish and Christian traditions. Often when the Bible speaks of poverty, it refers to a state of utter dependence on God. The great sin identified in the Hebrew Bible is the temptation to make oneself Lord and Creator. The opposite of this arrogance, this pride, is spiritual poverty. And as the Medellin fathers put it, quote, spiritual poverty is the attitude of opening up to God, the ready disposition of one who hopes for everything from the Lord, end quote. When the psalmist places his or her hope in God, when Jesus says one must lose one's life to gain it, and when Paul says the life I lead is no longer mine, but Christ living in me, we have examples of spiritual poverty. By differentiating spiritual poverty from material poverty, the bishops strike out against any attempt to have Christian extolling of poverty be confused with the scandalous reality that is never condoned by the Christian faith. Their connection is found in the third meaning that the bishops identify. The bishops speak of poverty as commitment, quote, through which one assumes voluntarily and lovingly the conditions of the needy of this world in order to bear witness to the evil which it represents and to spiritual liberty in the face of material goods, following the example of Christ. In the face of material poverty and striving for spiritual poverty, the calling of the Christian today is to make a commitment that has been called the preferential option for the poor. This commitment takes the form of solidarity. In a time when the presence of the poor and the reality of structural evil has come to light, the solidarity enacted in the preferential option for the poor is an essential element of Christian discipleship. Returning to the notion of martyrdom, and to my conclusion, you can say with relief, I believe that the threefold definition of poverty laid out by the bishops at Medellin offers us an interesting language for bringing together the rich tradition of martyrdom with the experience of the many violent deaths today. In terms of Romero's legacy, we can see how if we delineate different meanings for martyrdom, they help address our questions. Regarding death, we can see that inextricable to Romero's martyrdom and those so many behind him is the scandalous reality of poverty and injustice. As messengers of this reality, as Romero put it, these martyrs cannot be honored or understood torn from this context. Moreover, these martyrs share in the witness, the testimony of those who have borne the weight of the sin of this world. Though space prevents me from developing this more, the clear way that Medellin identifies material poverty is the same way we can acknowledge the crucified people as martyrs of reality in a way that does not valorize their suffering. Theirs is the cry of Abel's blood. Theirs are the moans from Egypt. Their testimony will be like that of Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham. And while accounting for this negativity in the understanding of martyrdom, one that with Metz refuses to look at the victims of history and either rationalize or redeem too quickly, there is a proper place to acknowledge the positive language of martyrdom throughout the tradition, whether it be early medieval lauding of the sacrifice of ascetics or the Celtic praise of the so-called white martyrs. Utter devotion and dependence on God marks a spiritual disposition crucial to the Christian martyr. However, this disposition, like spiritual poverty, finds its meaning in the face of hatred, of the fierce opposition that leads to the martyr's death. This odium is revealing not in the persecutor's mind, but how it leads us to unite the death of the martyr with his or her life. Finally, the notion of poverty as commitment or solidarity permits us to see the fullness of witness in those martyrs who gave their lives in the struggle for peace and for justice. Moreover, it properly identifies these efforts to make present the reign of God as intrinsically the work of faith. Thus, their lives can be evaluated as a full confessio to the glory of God, even if a word was never spoken or a trial never held. Recognizing martyrs of solidarity can even open doors to see how the Spirit moves beyond the boundaries of the church. But that too is a discussion for another time. Romero knew poverty as a boy in Ciudad Barrios, even taking leave from minor seminary to work in the mines to help support his family. He encountered the sufferings of farm workers and the malnutrition of children as bishop in Santiago de Maria. As Archbishop of San Salvador, he heard the tearful stories of family members whose relatives had disappeared. He heard, as he called it, the voice of blood, and it transformed him. This transformation was built upon a lifelong quest to serve God and the church, as his episcopal motto signified, sentir con la iglesia. The piety, the devotion, the scrupulous attention to penance, the endless hours of dedication and service all formed part of a life utterly dedicated in self-surrender to the will of God. They signal that even before becoming Archbishop, Romero was a dedicated man of God. Yet, as Jesus' words to the inquiring young man who sought salvation, the Lord required one more thing of Romero. As Archbishop, Oscar Romero enacted a preferential option for the poor that put him into conflict with those who opposed his efforts. Because Romero sought nothing other than to evangelize, to bring good news to his country and his people, he was murdered. His was surely a death in hatred of a faith that took the form of solidarity. His devotion to God led him to take that elevated office of Archbishop down from its throne and in solidarity take on the fate of the poor. Yes, he has risen in the Salvadoran people, and they are a people whose cries we must hear, whether trying to cross the border, to struggle for clean water, or against mining, or to work for peace among gangs. But by responding to these cries with commitment and solidarity, we best honor Monsignor Oscar Romero, martyr of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. In a conference marked by some pretty outstanding presentations, I think this was a very high note, and it makes it difficult for me to follow such a profound reflection. But as I am not only Michael's admirer and friend, but also his editor, there's a fittingness. The editor should have the last word. As Michael noted, as the first bishop slain at the altar since Thomas Becket in the 12th century, Romero would seem to have an easy claim on most commonplace definitions of martyrdom. Romero certainly anticipated his fate, and there was no doubt for him about the meaning of such a death. As we have heard, he said a couple weeks before he died, "Martyrdom is a great gift from God that I do not believe I have earned. But if God accepts the sacrifice of my life, then may my blood be the seed of liberty and a sign of the hope that will soon become a reality. A bishop will die, but the Church of God, the people, will never die." If in the case of Romero, the Church, meaning the Vatican in this case, has hesitated for 34 years to bestow the title of martyr, this apparently has to do with a particular criterion. As Michael's noted, the martyr's death must be prompted by hatred of the faith, odium fidei. This definition, drawn from Classic accounts of martyrdom under the Roman Empire served to characterize the martyrs of the Elizabethan Reformation, the victims of persecution in Japan, Vietnam, and revolutionary France. In modern times, it was applied to the targets of anti-Catholic persecution in Spain, Mexico, and various communist countries. Grudgingly, it was applied to certain Catholics killed by the Nazis. But it is a term that has not, up to this point, been applied to any of the tens of thousands of Christians, whether priests, nuns, lay people, or bishops, killed by the military, death squads, or other agents of national security in Latin America in the bloody decades of the 70s and 80s. Certainly there's a willingness, as Michael quoted Pope Benedict XVI, to recognize in Romero, quote, an important witness of the faith, a man of great Christian virtue. Yet it is striking in the case of Romero and all the others he represents how much church officials seem to choke over the M word. Even Pope Francis, as we've heard, while clearly indicating his interest in accelerating Romero's canonization, cites this problem. On the subject of Romero, as we've heard, the Pope comments, "What I would like is a clarification about martyrdom in odium fide, whether it can occur either for having confessed the creed or for having done the works which Jesus commands with regard to one's neighbor." And that, he says, is a task for the theologians. It'd be interesting to know who are the theologians tasked with this discernment. Whether they include, for instance, the theologians who prepared the Vatican notification on the work of John Sobrino, who found that, quote, while the preoccupation of the author for the plight of the poor is admirable, unquote, his work was riddled with, quote, dangerous and erroneous propositions. Needless to say, the notion of dangerous propositions means something different in the context of a Vatican office than it does for a theologian whose community members were massacred on the lawn of their university. Here's a problem for these theologians. In the case of Romero and so many others, there's the question of whether their killers were inspired by hatred of the faith or by the belief that their victims had mixed themselves up in politics. The peculiarity of the situation arises from the fact that the killers called themselves Catholics. Both they and their victims, you might say, shared the same creed, so you see the problem. In a peculiar way, I think as Michael indicates, this shifts the definition of martyrdom away from the faith of the martyrs to what you might call the faith of their killers. In other words, in this case, there's an inclination to accept at face value the expressed motivation of their killers, or as we heard yesterday, some of their Episcopal apologists, who say they did not target their victims because they were Catholics, surely not for that reason, but because they were subversives. The case for the devil's advocate was presented succinctly by the Honorable Jean Kirkpatrick, at the time President Reagan's ambassador designate to the UN. You might remember this. Regarding the murder of 4 U.S. churchwomen in El Salvador, she said, "The nuns were not just nuns. The nuns were political activists. We ought to be a little more clear-cut about this than we usually are. They were political activists on behalf of the Frente, and somebody who was using violence to oppose the Frente killed them." Although, in fact, these women had no connection with the rebels. That doesn't really undercut the ambassador's basic point. Indeed, the sisters were not killed, or in this case, as she failed to mention, also raped, because they were Catholics or because they were sisters, but because they were labeled as subversives. We do need to be a little more clear-cut about this than we usually are. But what made them subversives? What were they subverting? In line with the teachings of the Latin American bishops in Medellin and Puebla, these women had adopted a preferential option for the poor. In doing so, they posed a threat to a social order built on massive injustice and enforced with brutal violence. Anyone who challenged or questioned this social order was by definition a subversive, whatever their motivation. Like Archbishop Romero, these churchwomen understood the risks they were taking. Like him, they faced the option of abandoning their mission, but they refused, instead remaining faithful to the end. The night before they died, one of the 4, Sister Ida Ford, quoted these words of Romero, "One who is committed to the poor must risk the same fate as the poor." And in El Salvador, we know what the fate of the poor signifies: to disappear, to be tortured, to be captive, and to be found dead. But if this social order was enforced by violence, it was also, we must acknowledge, sustained by religious ideology. For many centuries, going back to the original invasion and evangelization of the Americas, the ruling powers in Latin America could count on their alliance with the church. They could rely on bishops to bless the social order and to decry social conflict as a violation of the will of God. They could count on priests and sisters, even when they served the poor, never to raise questions about why there were so many poor. They counted on the church to preach a message of otherworldly salvation, a gospel shorn of any prophetic disturbance of the status quo. In return, the ruling elites and their military enforcers styled themselves as pious defenders of the faith and champions of moral values. They liked to pose with bishops and invite them to bless their parades and say grace at their country club functions. They made a big show of their children's first communions. Following Vatican II, with the Episcopal assemblies in Medellin and Puebla, significant elements of the church in Latin America began to break with this tradition. Through a renewed reading of the gospel from the perspective of the poor, many Christians discovered the social content of Jesus' teachings on the kingdom of God. And they saw his death in new terms as well, not simply as a cultic sacrifice for the redemption of sin, but as a consequence of his praxis, which threatened the political and religious elites of his day. Jesus, it became apparent, was killed as a subversive. So we return to the question for the theologians: how could Romero and all these others be killed in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith, when the killers themselves are Catholics? One way, of course, is to expand the definition of martyrdom, to say a martyr can die for practicing the teachings of Jesus, not just for confessing the creed. And various exceptions have been made, as Michael noted, including Maria Goretti and Maximilian Kolbe, and recently Pino Piglusi, a Sicilian priest who stood up against the mafia. Yet the special Romero dilemma persists. How do we recognize as a martyr someone who, motivated by gospel principles, dies for naming and denouncing the sinful structures of an unjust, though nominally Catholic society? Michael has proposed a definition of the martyr of solidarity, whose commitment to follow Jesus faithfully in a preferential option for the poor was consummated in a death carried out by those who opposed this life of discipleship. Along similar lines, John Sobrino has spoken of what he calls Jesuanic martyrs, those who died not only for confessing Jesus, but like Jesus, on account of their witness to the kingdom of God and their commitment to the poor. In El Salvador, an overwhelmingly Catholic country named for the Savior, Romero and such martyrs were not killed simply for confessing membership in the church or for proclaiming the creed. They died because their understanding of the gospel put them in solidarity with the oppressed and in opposition to the structures of injustice. Like Jesus, they died because their faith had made them dangerous to the power structures of their society. In a society animated by odium pauperum, hatred of the poor, their active solidarity caused them, as Romero put it, to take on the destiny of the poor. And I agree with Michael that we obscure the meaning of martyrdom if we focus, as he says, so much on the death of the martyr that the life that preceded the final testimony is lost. Michael and John Sobrino shift our attention to the specific discipleship that resulted in the martyr's fate. In other words, this understanding of martyrdom restores our attention to the historical circumstances of Jesus' life and death. In the creed, we jump from his birth to his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate without pausing to confess any commitment to the actions, attitudes, or teachings that led to his torture and ignominious death. In this sense, the martyrs do more than confess the credo. With their very lives, they elaborate and offer an historically relevant commentary on its meaning. In this light, I would say that the real task for the theologians is not simply to analyze the definition of martyrdom, but to distinguish carefully between the faith, hope, and love exemplified by the martyrs and the hatred this inspired in their killers. I don't want to let go too easily of the idea that Romero and his companions were also killed in odium fidei. I wouldn't want to go to the way of Jeane Kirkpatrick or those who imply that if they had just stuck to being traditional nuns, priests, or bishops, they would not have ended up on a hit list. As I noted, Jesus ended up on a hit list. And he explicitly instructed his disciples that anyone who took his teachings seriously was liable to meet the same fate. I'd like to quote from the sermon on Rotilio Grande from February 13th, 1977, a little passage that Tom didn't, but I think is very telling. He says, "I'm aware that very soon the Bible and the gospel won't be allowed to cross our borders. We'll only get the bindings because all the pages are subversive. And I think that if Jesus himself came across the border at Chalatenango, they wouldn't let him in. They would accuse the man-god, the prototype of man, of being a rabble-rouser, a foreign Jew, one who confused the people with exotic and foreign ideas, ideas against democracy, that is, against the wealthy minority, the clan of Cains. Brothers, without any doubt, they would crucify him again, and God forbid that I should be one of the crucifiers. He was killed 1 month later, and if he was not killed in odium fidei, in hatred of his faith, I don't know what that means, by so-called Christians whose actions reveal their true faith. No doubt in preaching a gospel of justice, peace, and solidarity, Romero was regarded by many as a traitor or a subversive. Doubtless among his fellow bishops who held much sway in Rome, Romero should have stuck to a gospel message that strayed away from the social reality of his country. He might have done this, and thus he might have lived. As he noted in Louvain, not any and every priest has been persecuted. Not any and every institution has been attacked. Only, he said, that part of the church which has placed itself at the side of the people and has gone to their defense. And perhaps the reason for delay in recognizing the sanctity of Romero and the lengthy need over many decades to comprehend his brand of martyrdom is not because of the way he died, but the troubling way so many of us who call ourselves Christians, not just his fellow bishops, nevertheless manage to live such long and untroubled lives. To name Romero a martyr is not just to call into question the faith of his killers. It raises troubling questions about ourselves and that other part of the church which fails, quote, to place itself at the side of the people and go to their defense. Those church officials who balk at calling Romero a martyr are not motivated so much by odium fidei. His faith does not inspire their hate. It merely makes them uncomfortable. Nevertheless, to truly name and recognize the martyrdom of Archbishop Romero is a significant act. It is first of all to nullify the odium fidei of his killers. To name Romero a martyr and not simply a man of great Christian virtue is to make a great leap of amor fidei, a love of the faith he embodied, a love for the church of God, that is, the people, as he said, for which he offered his life. And perhaps it is well that we take plenty of time to consider this, remembering that when Romero named and recognized and loved the faith of Rutilio Grande, that is when he truly embarked on his own road to Calvary. To name Romero a martyr is not to bestow some kind of reward on him, nor is it just payback for his enemies, but a profound challenge to all of us, especially those of us who recognize him as our guia, to continue on his path, the way that he pointed. But meanwhile, in conclusion, as the theologians take all the time they need to ponder the witness of Romero, Rutilio Grande, the U.S. churchwomen, Ignacio Ellacuría and his fellow Jesuits, we must acknowledge another kind of witness that still awaits a name. Yesterday, Claudia related some of the story of El Mozote, a small hamlet in Morazon where there was a terrible massacre in 1981. She spoke of the sole survivor, Rufina Amayo, who was put at the end of a line of women taken out to be executed after already seeing her husband decapitated. And when she arrived at the site where she was to be killed, Rufina fell to her knees. Quote, I was crying and begging God to forgive my sins. Though I was almost at the feet of the killers, I wasn't begging them, I was begging God. But in a moment when the soldiers weren't looking, she seized the opportunity to crawl away and hid herself in some bushes, where she remained for several days, shivering, thirsty, bleeding, watching and listening as the soldiers completed their mission. The children were the last to go, and she had to hear the sounds of her own children being killed, biting her tongue to keep from screaming. That night, she overheard some of the soldiers discussing the faith of the people they had killed. One young girl in particular remained on their minds. While they had raped her repeatedly, she had continued to sing hymns. Even after they shot her in the chest, she sang. They shot her again, and still she sang. And then, quote, their wonder began to turn to fear until finally they unsheathed their machetes and hacked through her neck, and at last the singing stopped. As Claudia noted, perhaps as many as 1,000 people died in El Mozote. Rufina survived to bear witness to those terrible deeds, but there is another kind of witness offered by the victims, in particular, that anonymous young girl who confronted her assassins with hymns of praise and who thus bore witness to her faith in a power stronger than her assailant's capacity to inflict injury. Such stories are a gift and a grace to the church, but they are also a challenge. We don't have to compare ourselves to giants like Oscar Romero. What is our faith compared to that of that anonymous peasant girl? Do we truly believe in the resurrection? How do we make that faith real and credible in face of the ongoing crucifixion of the poor? We do so not simply by remembering their faith and courage, but by doing all we can to remove them from their cross. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Bob. And now we have a few minutes for questions. Please.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. When I saw Martyr of Solidarity, I was reminded of the solidarity that Archbishop Romero had for his people when he wrote the letter to President Carter, asking him to stop and asking us to stop sending the aid that came bathed in so much blood. And about, there's just been very little that's been said here about the role of the United States in all that happened in El Salvador. And that great act of solidarity that was fairly early in his 3 years, I believe. Which year? I'm not sure which year that was. Was it 79?
The letter?
The letter.
It was actually pretty late.
Yeah, okay. 79, okay. But just an amazing, really, gesture and act that he took upon himself on behalf of everyone. So if you have anything to say about that.
Well, perhaps the only comment to make is while at the one level, a letter from an archbishop to the president of another country could be looked at as political. Again, we can't let separations like these cloud the fact that the experience behind which that letter is composed and the convictions of faith that led him to write that letter cannot be then taken from that circle we call faith and put into the circle that we separate out and call politics. So I think what you're drawing to is exactly the point that I'm making. I wasn't saying that was your question. My comment is exactly that. We need to make sure that we look at that letter to Carter. And yes, we can say it's different than his writing a homily or a pastoral letter, but at the same time, it's part and parcel of this integrated faith. It is the faith. So if his dad, for instance, is in hatred for writing that letter, hey, we're still talking about a hatred of faith.
Just to follow up on that point, the way in which the Roman Catholic nuns here in this country challenged the lobbyists of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on healthcare is a small example of the point that you were just making. It circles back to the legitimacy of the voice of religious communities in confronting the barbarity that you and Robert have called to our attentions. It is a conference for each and every one of us through the spiritual conversion that we have focused on and right down to this point that you're making right now. Political testimony does not get boxed into a thing called capital P politics, divorced from our faith, capital F, by the fact that we are attentive to the cry of the poor and to the elegant and powerful way that you and Robert have cast our responsibility. Not to be better than them, not to stew in some canonical process for decades, wondering whether or not witness is witness, but to carry on with our daily and regular engagement in the political order along the lines of what the two of you have just witnessed to.
Hi, I'm Doug Castle from the law school. I want to say those were two of the most moving and articulate presentations of what I think the church ought to be about that I've ever heard, and I thank you both. Part of me, however, was sort of frustrated. Part of me as a layperson, and I know next to nothing about theology, says, what does it matter to me or anyone else whether you call the killing of a man who died for carrying out his faith a, quote, martyr, or instead just call him someone who died for his faith? What I take away from what both of you told us was what it means to be a Christian, and what are the obligations of a Christian to live a Christian life. And whether some people in Rome or anywhere else choose to put a label on a good man who did good things and died for it doesn't, to me, as an individual, frankly, matter. But I assume it must have some big importance for academic theologians or maybe for his process of canonization. So my question to you is, leaving out the part about whether he was a martyr and endorsing everything else both of you said and being moved by it, what does it matter?
My answer would be that why it matters is precisely because that naming, that conviction that you have about him is never going to stay in one place, and it's never going to stay the same. As I suggested at the beginning of the paper, Romero's legacy is and will be constantly under negotiation. And when you think of Dorothy Day's hesitation when asked about her own possible canonization, right? Please don't make me that irrelevant. All these dynamisms, what we do with saints or martyrs, or how these legacies are described, portrayed, employed, this is what's up for grabs. So while at the one hand it can seem arcane stuff that keeps us publishing, hey, there's nothing wrong with making a living, you know. No, what can seem arcane arguments, the lasting impact that many of us in this room know, right? Because we can all agree with the statement, hey, Romero's already a saint, right? He's already San Romero. And yet we keep struggling and hoping for this canonization. Why? Because it's a gold ribbon of some sort? No, for me at least, it's something about the church global adding its voice to this chorus of yes, and hoping that that naming has that effect even over the time. In the Catholic Church, we think in centuries and millennia, hopefully, not just days and weeks. And so this naming, and then the fight over even what that naming means, because as the days, weeks, years, decades move on, how will we reflect on this period? That's the ongoing question. And so I don't know if this gets to your concern. Why does this matter? I think it really does matter, because it's all about, well, what are we naming here? What is this legacy that this whole conference has been trying to portray? And of course, tradition, to pass on. I mean, it's what is the Romero traditio? What is going to be handed on, and how is that going to be named? So I think that's, for me, the importance of this.
One more question. Well, this is more a presentation of doubt, which at the end of Saturday, perhaps you can help me put together, not only represent it. In the year 2011, 3 paradigmatic cases started being lifted from the courts in El Salvador. The cases that are known historically as being evident violations of human rights that were not being tried in El Salvador. One case is in Mozote, the Jesuits and Monsignor Romero. So much has been said in this conference about his sainthood. And I wonder if you have a thought or think about it, whether or not this idea of proclamation of the sainthood of Monsignor may interrupt the court case, identifying that he was a man, a civilian, unarmed, and killed illegally. And I think, I don't see this as a either or, but I see a potential cultural conflict in assuming that if Monsignor is a saint, he doesn't need the court of justice. And that preoccupies me.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that's why I tried to emphasize the way that the martyr's death is tied to these wider deaths. And so even just that notion of picking one out, and that somehow by sainthood it's in a different class, in a different legal status or anything like that, is precisely how these martyrs find themselves with so many ones of El Mosot that we don't even know their names. And yet their deaths each tied, and so we would not want to sever those. Each illuminating the other. So I don't know if that really speaks to that concern, but for me, that individual, yeah, it would be making sure that it stays tied. And so acknowledging it actually hopefully draws attention and draws light to all of them.
Thank you. During the persecution of the church in Mexico, there was abhorrence in this country over what was going on, the killing of priests and bishops and so on, and sisters and lay people. And so there was support from the church. The American bishops established a seminary in exile in New Mexico, in my state, where for several decades they prepared priests during that difficult time. Also, the border dioceses received many religious orders of men and women who came to live and establish themselves. We still have a legacy of them. Some of them remained even after the persecution in those border dioceses. With regards to the plight of the church in El Salvador during this very difficult time, what was the response of the American church? I know that the Jesuits were very strong in their response because of the martyred Jesuits in UCA, and also the killing of those women religious. They happened to be from Cleveland. And I know Cardinal Hickey was deeply moved by what happened there. He reacted in a very emotional, beautiful way. So there was a response, but I don't know whether this question might be directed completely with a vivid memory, and I don't have the memory he has of what was the response of the American church, maybe even the American bishops.
Being a member of the Bishops' Conference at that time, Bishop Ramirez, you might remember all the statements that you were called upon to affirm. If you look at the Bishops' Conference website, you go to Latin America and statements, and go through the statements of the 70s, the 80s, there's an awful lot of them, including all of the issues that we've talked about today, the women, Romero, etc. It was, I think, quite extraordinary for the history of that church. There was also, Bishop Ramirez raises a very interesting issue that is very little thought about today, but the persecution of the church in Mexico. And there was a major statement, one of the most important statements ever made at that time by the bishops. They issued a pastoral letter. They had not issued pastoral letters as such. They issued one on the church in Mexico. It's little known today, but it's quite a powerful statement when you look at it, even in the light of the present situation. So the answer, I don't want to go on, the answer to Ricardo's question is a hell of a lot. There's lots of stuff done by the U.S. Catholic Conference during those days, and I invite you all to look at it.
And maybe just as a quick footnote, in addition to that, I know my experience with the Committee on Central America, our worker house in Phoenix tied to a worker house in Tucson that was doing sanctuary. I mean, the response of the church at the ground level was so powerful as well. And persecuted by this government as well, investigated, groups being followed by the CIA, etc. So that it's a multi-level answer to that question, what the church's response was.
Please join me in thanking our presenters. Now we have something that's not on the schedule, Bob. It's okay. We'll be all right. And
just before we proceed with the tribute to the next, and then the La Misa Salvadoreña we're all waiting for, let us just use this next couple minutes to deliver a small package, as Claudia said yesterday, to no saludar con el sombrero de otro. We asked two dear friends of everybody here to give us some couple of words of wisdom to present, and we all will participate as well. So I will invite Margie File and Padre Gustavo in a minute.
well, Bob, I take, it's my blessing and privilege to speak on behalf of everyone here and many generations of students and other pastoral workers who have come into contact with you over decades, both as a priest and a scholar, to thank you for your witness. This conference incarnates the depth of your love for the church and your commitment to the church. And you are a brother of Romero, I think we all know that. And I also wanted to specifically focus on your connection between the ecclesial communities of North America and the rest of the Americas and what that has meant. I also speak as a laywoman, and I want to extend thanks on behalf of women in the church, both religious and lay. We've heard mention now several times of the 4 churchwomen, 3 religious and 1 laywoman. And I have this icon, speaking of icons, of the 4 churchwomen. And I'd like to give this to you on behalf of everyone here.
aplauso se adelanta a lo que me pidieron decir, que es, yo sé, va a ser una pequeña molestia para vos, que escuchar públicamente, con fuerza, el agradecimiento que le debemos, por supuesto, no solo a esta gracias, creo que me oye, no te preocupes. A esta reunión, a este congreso, queremos agradecerle por su vida. Mucho lo conocemos, una buena parte de ella, yo más o menos la mitad de su vida, y muchos otros también. Queremos agradecerle eso a él, ese testimonio, su fidelidad a compromiso con los más pobres de América Latina, también siempre muy abierto a esa problemática. Agradecerle también a su sentido del humor. El sentido del humor es muy importante. Considero que falta una bienaventuranza. Bienaventurados los tercos, porque el reino de los cielos es de ellos. Los obstinados, ¿no? Tienen y eso es suavemente, delicadamente, es muy obstinado. Lo hecho sino lo mismo toda su vida. Es decir, comprometerse con nosotros, saber escuchar, y todo eso me parece sumamente importante. Y estar muy atento también a la realidad que viven las personas, ¿no? Y no como aquel que decía, qué bien estaríamos si no fuera por la realidad. Estaríamos muy bien, ¿no? Bueno, pues no, yo creo que el juicio sobre esa realidad de sufrimiento para muchas personas. Finalmente lo que tanto hablamos de compromiso con los pobres es eso, es acercarnos a quienes su vida es un sufrimiento muchas veces. No que desconozcan la alegría, sin alegrías no hay ser humano posible, pero de todas maneras son vidas muy duras y todo eso comporta este compromiso. Agradecerle entonces a Borpo y, por cierto, esta reunión. Uno de ustedes me decía esta mañana, al pasar nomás, pero algo que coincido plenamente con esa opinión, me decía, esto para mí ha sido un retiro espiritual, este congreso. Yo confieso que yo también lo siento así. Tal vez no lo hubiera expresado tan rápidamente, como ese amigo que me está escuchando además, porque está acá. Y yo creo que es verdad, creo que esto es una memoria de un testimonio importante. Estamos aquí muy poquitos, pero algunos de los que estuvimos en el entierro de Romero. Naturalmente, muchos otros ya se jubilaron de la vida, ¿no? Pero yo creo que es interesante haber estado juntos personas de diferentes generaciones, de diferentes momentos. Creo que eso es siempre una riqueza muy grande. Entonces, es una acción de gracias, la vamos a hacer de la mejor manera posible. En la Eucaristía, claro está, pero se había pensado tenerla acá de esta manera. Boco, gracias por tu vida, gracias por tu amistad. Le pongo mucho peso también en mi parte personal en esas gracias, pero no quiero ponerme el asunto. Todos te agradecemos eso. Y me había sido sugerido que tuviéramos un pequeño gesto para subrayar, digamos, rubricar esta acción de gracias, que es una bendición de todos nosotros a vos. Te pedimos que subas para que recibas esta bendición. Venga. Ahí. Sí, pero te lo voy a...
Gracias.
No entiendo. Bueno, chileno entiendes mejor.
I just like, if I may, just a couple of words. First, one of the people here is Jessica Brock, who's a lawyer in South Bend. She was the first undergraduate in the first honoring of Romero. It was the late undergraduate student representative and did a fabulous job. And here she is again. That's wonderful. And I think another thing that's wonderful is Margie herself, because I've tracked Margie since she was an undergraduate, and she went to Chile as an associate, then she went off, got a few degrees, came back, got a doctorate in Notre Dame, and when Mike Connors was worrying about what do I say, well, I said, I should read her doctoral dissertation. And I assisted, was present at her defense, which was fabulous. And matter of fact, was able to even collaborate and witnessing her marriage with their great husband, Bill. Catholic Mennonite marriage, which is structure. Great. So I thank all of you very, very much.
What we're going to do now is just two things more. Please stand up and extend your hands over. Gustavo is going to lead us in a short prayer.
Los cristianos tenemos la mala costumbre de decir que las bendiciones sobre asuntos materiales que están en la Biblia, en el Primer Testamento, son pues materiales. Bueno, pero en la costumbre bíblica es bendecir deseando cosas. Que tu salud esté siempre bien, que puedas hacer todo lo que tú deseas y poder entregar tu tiempo y tu capacidad a tantos en este mundo. Tu campo de acción es sumamente vasto, que el Espíritu Santo esté siempre inspirando tu vida y te deseamos todo eso en el nombre del Padre, del Hijo y del Espíritu Santo.
Amén.
Now, just two words. I'm sorry to extend. Beto, por favor. Beto has something to present here to Father Bob as well in Father Gustavo.
Disculpen que me presento sin cumplir la promesa que hice ayer a ustedes de hablar mejor inglés. Fíjense que fácilmente incumplo las promesas, en primer lugar. En segundo lugar, disculpen también, y especialmente a Romero, porque no nos permitía a los abogados de la iglesia presentarnos en una tribuna como esta sin corbata. Los abogados de la iglesia, decía él, deben presentarse adecuada y apropiadamente vestidos, no casualmente, Roberto. Si me matan, dijo él una vez, antes de su muerte martirial, voy a resucitar en mi pueblo, pero resuciten ustedes permanentemente. A mí me correspondió la fortuna, dirían unos, el triste privilegio de representar a la iglesia en aquella noche trágica, examinando el cuerpo de Romero, examinando el cadáver de Romero después del crimen y el magnicidio. A mí me correspondió organizar con los médicos forenses y con los jueces ese acto administrativo, ese acto forense, ese acto que es requerido para la sucesión y ese acto que es requerido por el derecho canónico, ustedes lo saben muy bien, para organizar los funerales 7 días después. Sin ese documento no se puede seguir adelante. Y tuve que declarar ante las autoridades oficiales la muerte de Romero. Tuve que asentar la muerte de Romero, el crimen contra Romero, el magnicidio contra Romero ante las autoridades. No fue fácil, 3 días después de su muerte, en aquel ambiente. Hoy, hace 2 meses, quise buscar el documento, no lo encontraba. Lo logré. Tuve el documento original en mis manos después de 34 años y me propuse traerlo ahora a usted, Padre Pelton, a usted, Fray Gustavo Gutiérrez, como muestra de un tributo a Notre Dame que hace resucitar permanentemente a Romero en El Salvador y el mundo con este homenaje que ustedes le hacen. Padre Pelton, usted es un prócer para nosotros. Fray Gustavo Gutiérrez, usted es un inspirador permanente. Esta noche voy a entregar un documento al Fondo Romero, a Julián, mi amigo, que dice que no tiene el documento también. Saqué 3, 4 documentos del original certificado y quiero entregar también a uno de mis héroes favoritos, lo saben ustedes. Pero hoy, esta tarde, como tributo a Notre Dame por esto que hacen todos los años, de tener a Romero en la reflexión permanente de su muerte martirial en el mundo, después de 34 años, quiero entregarlo al padre Robert Pelton y a Fray Gustavo Gutiérrez, el documento original que certifiqué ante las autoridades, porque les admiro, porque les respeto y tengo gratitud por ustedes. Gracias. Muchas gracias.
this is not a speech, just one more final gesture to Father Bob. No speech. We consider you a disciple of, one of the many disciples of Archbishop Romero, a co-conspirator in the struggle for his beatification, one of our leaders. So I would like to pass you, since we've had Latin America and North America, so the old continent, I'd like to make a presentation to you of a cross, the Salvador cross, which we're all doing this for Jesus Christ. This is the risen Christ, painted by Fernando Yot, and into the risen Christ he's drawn Oscar Romero. And this is, of course, the pagan eye of the Masons, as the Archbishop there said, but actually it's the eye of God the Father. And on the back you have the ministry of Jesus, the Last Supper, and the feeding of the 5,000. Wow.
Thank you, Father Bob, and thank you, everyone. So we should continue now.